on here. And notice that on the y-axis is the total amount of stored energy, right, the area under that curve. And here's the stiffness of the spring system, with this being very compliant springs, like really weak springs, and over there being really stiff springs, right? I'm gonna add one more thing, which is an expectation, which is because that the actual tendon stiffness, the actual tendon spring constant of frogs, is right at 10 newtons per millimeter. So if this question was true, if bullfrog tendons are tuned to maximize energy storage, we would see a peak in the simulation right at this line, right? But instead, we see something like this, where actually if the muscles were connected to springs that were more stiff or had a higher spring constant, you could get more elastic energy out of the system, right? So let's take a look at that for a second. Our muscle model is a muscle connected to a spring, right? Which are equal to these equations, and what we did is we crossed these out because we didn't care about the journey. We didn't care about any of the in-between points, which means that we take the system at rest and fully get the result at full contraction, right? So is that actually, though, how the bullfrogs use the spring system biologically? Like, do they actually get to this endpoint? And again, we're going to be dealing with the very top of the triangle, thinking about analyzing the results that we got from here in the context of how the bullfrog is using its spring. And so we went back into the literature and we found from this study that if you actually take the muscle out and you stimulate it, you get maximum contraction at 100 milliseconds, right? So you stick electrodes in it, you excite it, it takes 100 milliseconds to get full contraction. The study also shows that the muscle only stretches the string for 50 milliseconds before it starts to jump, right? So if you notice, there is a difference here. This is the full contraction of the muscle, which is basically what we're simulating, and this is what the animal is actually using. So looking at this together, you can tell that the muscle is not fully contracted prior to jump. And again, this being the model endpoint, right, of a model, and this being the actual biologically relevant endpoint. And so what we really want to do is look at what's actually happening here at 50 milliseconds. And to do that, then we need to construct this dynamic muscle model where we can't ignore those dynamic factors. All right, so it starts off exactly the same, force equals force, right? Force of the muscle equals force of the spring. We break down the equations down here, but now we can't ignore these dynamic factors. They actually play a role. And I just want to show you why this equation is so difficult to solve. So I'm going to bring down all the terms, except I'm going to change velocity into delta x, delta t, right? So another way to think of velocity is you can just put in a delta, so it's how much it stretches and the time scale that it stretches over. And so notice it's exactly the same. I brought F activation down, changed this to delta x, delta t, brought all those terms down. Now the reason why this is such a difficult equation to solve, or more difficult than the previous one, is the fact that x of m, right here, it affects force both in a direct way, right? It directly affects force of muscle and directly affects force of spring, but also x of m indirectly affects the force due to velocity. And so what we'd really like to do is at every time step, find a single value of x of m that satisfies that equation. Right? I'm not going to go through the details, but just to quickly show you what I did, I isolated every instance of x of m onto one side of an equation, everything else to the other side, and I wrote a double pass numerical integrator to solve that equation for multiple time steps. None of that is important, just I found a way to do this using computer coding kung fu. All right, and so we repeated the same thing where we took the empirical data from the muscle, connected springs of various thicknesses to it, and we asked the same question: are bullfrog tendons tuned to maximize energy storage, but with the added caveat that we're only looking within 50 milliseconds, right? So we're tweaking the question slightly. And so what we found, and I'm just setting up the results plot again, what we found is that in terms of the results, that we get actually really close, right? Again, this dotted line being the actual measured spring constant of the bullfrogs, and this being, like, I guess the optimal, like the spring constant that generates that allows the maximum maximum amount of elastic energy to be stored, right? So looking at these two things together, I think is really important, right? So this is the static model, this is the dynamic model. And the results that we really get from it are that, one, bullfrog tendons maximize energy storage at biologically relevant loading times, right? So in this case, it suggests that bullfrog tendons don't store maximal elastic energy. This one says that it does if we only ask the correct question and we actually target the biologically relevant timescales, right? And I think that this is another important point that we should make, is that, you know, I've talked about this triangle, marching up this triangle, trying to get towards universal principles. And the interesting thing is that even if you get towards the mechanics, even if you get towards, you know, understanding the engineering behind springs, like that's still not enough, right? Like, this model is our basic engineering, right? Like understanding like the physics behind it, and still like there's nothing wrong with that model, right? Like numerically, there's nothing wrong with it. In terms of like how we solved it, like there's no reason why this is incorrect. But by asking this question, you get a completely different answer, and actually, you know, you're actually asking a more biologically relevant question, and it gives you a different understanding, a more relevant understanding of how the spring system works. And so this is just to say that, you know, even like you can't just stop at how the engineering works. You have to bring it to the next level and figure out how the animal's using it to understand what's going on. All right. So you've seen this triangle a bunch of times, and I hope I've like provided this framework for addressing elastic systems in biology, where at first you need the foundational question: is there a spring? Then you can move up to answer what is the spring, how does the spring work in terms of its engineering, and also then how do these biological systems use that spring system. And I showed at the very beginning that different ways to address is there a spring. We could look at the power output, right, of different animals. Other things that we can look at are in terms of like deformation. So either the deformation of a mare spring system, or the implied deformation of a tendon by looking at muscles, right? We walked up and we addressed what is the spring. In some cases, it's relatively simple in terms of the bullfrog, where you know the tendon is going to be the spring. But I also provided a new way to look at spring structures that are connected together, right? In terms of how does the spring work mechanically, I didn't really talk about this too much, but I sort of implied that some of the work that I've done involves taking single structures and breaking them up and looking at what's happening internally. How you can think about a single structure as a set of connected structures, right? And also, I showed you this mathematical model, both the static and dynamic that we did in order to answer how the spring works mechanically. And finally, I also showed the importance of really looking at the models and making sure that they're biologically relevant, and that you're asking the really biologically appropriate questions using those models. And so what I hope I've done here is really emphasize the need to march up these triangles and to really move away from study-specific ways of looking at elastic systems and move towards answering really universal principles that binds the diversity of elastic systems in biology together. Right, and so you might be asking, like, what's happening next? Sheila already mentioned that I'll be starting an NSF postdoc with Tom Roberts. There's the title, basically, of my proposal that was sent out. From slow stretches to impulsive impacts, does tendon function change with stretch speed? So Sheila also did mention, I was moving there. This is the snowiest picture I could find, just to remind me that I'm going there in the winter. And just as like a quick little appetizer of like what's happening. This isn't really the species of frog that we'll be studying, but what I really want you to notice is that this frog, or this cane toad, jumps, right, as we expect with its hind limbs, but watch how it lands. So there's this neat problem going on here where the back tendons are doing something like fundamentally different from the front tendons, right? And so what I really want to address is whether or not the dynamic properties of those tendons are tuned or are helpful in terms of energy storage in the back legs and energy dissipation, right? Because you want to dissipate that energy when you land. But that's like one of the cool, neat projects that I'll be working on when I'm over there. And I just wanted to step through this really quickly. That was me as an archer. I wanted to put myself more in California, but I'll just cover up Alaska for now. So Sheila found me as an archer, right? And she like showed me the light. And she really introduced me to two people that were like super helpful in terms of getting the grips with my mechanical testing. This was undergrad at the time, Travis Sack and Jennifer Taylor. And also I had a lot of moral support, I don't know if you knew this, by a lot of the undergrads to really continue on with academic stuff, including Elliot and Marco. And I also met like my heroes at the time that like Thomas was like, well, he was French, first of all, he was super cool, but he also was like the master of art at the time, and he kept on saying like, hey, just do a loop, run a loop. And like really like they really guided me towards like, oh, like the things I should be like asking, the things I should be saying, the things I should be writing down in my book. But they were like super influential to getting me to this part of my career. And then of course we moved on to Massachusetts, and to the lab we added, I'm blanking on her name, Elizabeth and Patrick. I pulled this from your YouTube video thing. Every time I look at his screen, he's always looking at himself.
It's only sometimes true.
But then I also welcomed Suzanne, an engineering student, and Phil and Katsu, the postdocs that joined our lab at the time. I still remember meeting with them at SICB in Salt Lake City, just to chat and see what their ideas were, and they were super helpful in like clarifying my thought and my communication. They've been extremely helpful in terms of moving my research to the next level. And then of course we moved here, where we gained Rachel, Leah, and this is a pumpkin I carved of sheep. It's a very good pumpkin. So I just wanted to put this up there just to say that really, like if you look at this slide, this is maybe 90–95% of all the personnel listed in your lab, Sheila. So I've been with you through it all, and we've been through a lot.
Yes.
And like, really, it's been an amazing experience.